Hello everybody, and welcome back to Teachers Talk Radio at the BETT Show. I'm delighted to be joined now by legendary poet, author, thinker. I can't think of anything else, Michael. The list could go on and on. Michael Rosen, who's here with us today. Michael, we are Teachers Talk Radio, so I'm going to be asking you about some sort of education/teaching topics today. But I thought I'd start just briefly with what you're doing here at the BETT Show.
I'm here doing two or three things. I was talking about a book I wrote called Right to Feel Right, which is about, it's a book for children, probably primary age, but could be for lower secondary. And it's a little book published by Collins, which is about how you can write about emotions and feelings and difficult thoughts that you have. So it's really a kind of guide for young people. It's just a little booklet. Yeah, I was talking about that because I've tried to cope with various trauma, bereavement, loss, things like that in my life. And so it was informed by that. So I'm in a way trying to pass on some advice to children as to how they can write, maybe to release these difficult thoughts and feelings that you have in your head. So that was the main thing. And then the other thing was some awards for basically children have been going around this huge exhibition and picking what are their favourites, what they think are the most useful stalls, things, products, if you like, and we were handing out prizes. So I was helping with that.
I saw that bit as well. You had a very busy day. I want to ask you a little bit about education and teaching. So to start off with, what to you makes a good teacher?
It's a bit difficult because I don't want to kind of point the finger at sort of one teacher, as it were, but in my experience, in other words, with the teachers I had at school, teachers I've worked with, and I've worked with many teachers.
And just your opinion on
people
that you've worked with.
I think it's teachers who know how to handle the curriculum, whatever is given to them, but manage to deliver it, if I'm going to use the jargon, they manage to deliver it in ways that are very imaginative, very creative, and manage to find the spaces in between the stuff that they have to do to actually enable children to express themselves and to investigate and study things for themselves. Because there's a lot of material that teachers have to pass on to children, call that the curriculum. But in actual fact, we know it's very important for children to find out things for themselves, research things, and also to express themselves. And I found that teachers who manage to do that as well as delivering of the more instructional side, those are my favourite teachers.
Because there's been a real trend, particularly sort of in the last 5, 10, 15 years maybe, towards sort of, I guess, like teacher-led, more sort of teacher-led, direct instruction. Are you sort of against that? Or are you sort of, would you like to see more, inquiry-based learning, children finding things out for themselves?
Well, I'm not against instruction. I'm not against that. I'm a product of it. I went to an ordinary state primary school, then I went to 2 grammar schools. There was a lot of information passed over to us at those grammar schools.
Yeah.
I did French, German, Latin, history, geography, biology, all those subjects. As it happens, the biology was very interesting, and this is what partly informs me. We had a teacher who knew she had to get through the curriculum for O-level, as it was called then, GCSEs, but she'd spent an enormous amount of time encouraging us to investigate the very thing that she was teaching. So to take one example, so the issue of chlorophyll in leaves. Okay, so it's a piece of classic information.
Yeah.
Now you can stand out the front and lecture a group of children and tell them chlorophyll forms in leaves and this enables photosynthesis to take place. Photosynthesis is as follows. But she got us to experiment with putting things on geranium leaves and to see what would happen if you obscured the geranium leaf and why it went white and whether that enabled the plant to photosynthesize or not. And one child in our class said, do you know, if you put dark stuff onto a leaf, does that mean if you used what we used to call photonegatives, which were the opposite of the positive of a photograph, would that mean that if you put it onto the leaf, you could actually put yourself, a picture of your face, onto a geranium leaf?
Okay.
And our teacher, all credit to her, Miss Pope, she said, I don't know. Of course she did. Of course she did. But she said, I don't know. Shall we see if we can find out?
Yeah.
So there was a whole thing about putting them in cupboards and stuff. I forget the exact bit. And sure enough, out it came, and we had pictures of ourselves on the geranium leaves. And she was so over the moon.
Yeah.
And that was an experiment devised by a 15, 16-year-old. All right. And that was the kind of teacher she was. So I always think of that as an example of how to deliver the curriculum, but encourage and enable the creativity of the children in the class.
Do you think that, I mean, you might not know this, but one of sort of, I guess one of my concerns I've had over the last year, sort of, I mean, I'm a part-time history teacher now, is, because that sort of plays into what you're saying, is the sort of maverick teachers, I would call them. Teachers who sort of go off on tangents and sort of are more, I don't know, sort of, we call them mavericks or eccentric. I mean, there is that thing.
But it could just be, you say that, but it could just be flexible. I mean,
absolutely.
The problem with maverick and eccentric is we tend to park it and say, those are the people over there. That's the nutty professor or something. And the problem is it's not actually what we're talking about. You see, what Miss Pope did then was, she knew in the back of her mind, I've got to do chlorophyll, photosynthesis, osmosis, and all the rest, yeah? And then because this child said they were thinking about negatives, positives, and the rest of it, she, as it were, rewarded that. She didn't just go, well, I don't know, and we haven't got time.
Yeah.
She made the space for it. So I'm not going to call her eccentric, and I'm not going to call her maverick. I'm going to call her flexible, because that showed to me that she could accept and admire the creativity and learning that a child was bringing to this subject. Because if you think about it, now I've forgotten which one of our mates did it, but the point was that was somebody applying one bit of science to another bit of science, which after all, I mean, I'll try and avoid generalizations, but it's probably how the major breakthroughs in science have taken place. Just take one example, DNA.
Yeah.
So in order to find out the structure of DNA, there were all the geneticists and so on, but it actually took X-ray crystallography to find out the structure of DNA. And then they had to sit there and go, well, how come when a male and a female come together, the chromosomes don't all double up? So therefore, there has to be some structure that is enabled to peel off and then attach again. How would that work? And they played around, these people, with, I think, possibly pipe cleaners and things like that to work out. They had to apply one bit of science to another bit of science, one bit of technology to another bit. They had to be creative and flexible. And the idea, I mean, I'll give you one example. My son came back, he said, I've got homework to do. And I said, what is it? And he said, it's extraction of metal from ore. And I said, oh, right, have you been experimenting with that in class? He said, no. I said, what have we got to do then? He said, and he opened the textbook. And there were 2 pages on the extraction of metal from ore. And I said, do you know what ore is? He said, no, I don't know. I have no idea, Dad. Can we get on? And I said, well, if you've got to do this, what is ore? And so he had never handled any rock with ore in it. And as it happens, I've walked in Yorkshire. And in Yorkshire, you come across these rusty stones. There's ore. You can see it. I mean, I know it may not sound exciting, but, you just wish that somehow the teacher had brought in some chunks of ore, and said, well, believe it or not, or what do you think's in this? What colour is it? Do you know any kind of metal that goes kind of brown? Why? And then you'd be right into it. And instead, there was this picture at the top of the page. It looked like a potato stuck at the top of the page, and it said ore. And he didn't know whether it was a potato or a sponge or whatever. He had no idea. He'd never met the word ore before. O-R-E. We say it in the South, ore. Sounds like A-W. I mean, obviously, in Ireland and elsewhere in America, they say ore. At least you've got the R in it. Yeah. Ore. What is ore? You know what I mean? And then there was this set of equations and stuff down below. And it was so abstract, so far away from the idea of smashing up bits of rock and getting the metal out. And what an incredible discovery that was by humanity to be able to do that. Oh, none of it there.
Would you sort of sympathise with a teacher who said, I want to be maybe more creative or innovative, but because of behaviour issues in the classroom or the challenges I'm facing there, I just can't do it?
Well, I've every sympathy. I think there's too much in the curriculum. I think, we've worshipped at the God, the knowledge-led curriculum. without looking closely at who children are, what people need to learn, how they need to learn, how they may need diverse and different ways of learning, the idea of making everything so instrumental. And here was my lad, and I could see he was in at the deep end. There's just 2 pages, and he was just had to learn it. And it seems to me that I've totally sympathised with the teachers because there's too much of it. They can see, they come in, this is year 9, isn't it? They're coming in at year 9 or year 10, and they got this huge mountain they know they've got to get through. So they've worked out how many lessons, how many minutes, and then if there's a minute lost, they're going, oh my goodness, they're not going to be able to cover electrolysis. No, we didn't do electrolysis. Oh well, homework, electrolysis, and just dump it on them. And no, I don't blame the teachers at all. I utterly blame the curriculum designers, and I'm afraid the examiners, and originally I'm afraid a certain person who we don't need to name, who thought this was all a fantastic idea because he read a book once by somebody called Hirsch. And then he read this book and decided this is what we all need, otherwise China and Korea and Singapore will beat us. And education and the purpose of education was laid to one side, and they made predictions about what we will need in the new world, whatever this is going to be. Well, they have no more idea about it than you or me. I mean, it's guesswork. We don't know. We don't know the future, and they decided what the future is knowledge. And that if people haven't got knowledge and have got all this stuff, then somehow or other, we, Britain, would fall behind.
I've got my last question now. So I don't know whether you've noticed the controversy recently over Ofsted.
Yes.
And we've seen many sort of controversies in the last few weeks. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that and the way in which the current inspection system is set up for schools in the UK, and sort of wider worries you have about the education system in England and the UK in general.
Right. My view of Ofsted is that it's wrong for several reasons. The main reason is that it's punitive, and it's been punitive for many years. That's to say, Ofsted come in, and if you fail, whatever that means, then that school, that staff, that whole community is regarded as a failure.
Yeah.
This seems to me a completely misguided and wrong way to run education. I've seen schools fail. I know about schools failing. When schools fail, what they need is help, not punishment. We're not talking about crime. We're not talking about somebody who's shot somebody. We're talking about teachers trying to do their best, maybe struggling with all sorts of very difficult situations, not of their own making. Sometimes teachers with not very much experience, that's not their fault, that's not a crime. Well, do you know what we used to have in the 50s and the 60s? We had the idea that experienced teachers help less experienced teachers. It's a basic principle. Teaching involves knowledge, training, experience, personality, involves a huge range of abilities and facilities and emotions. And if you just simply narrow it down to they're not doing this in the way that I, Ofsted, in my supreme knowledge say, fail, and then all sorts of other big things start happening, like being put under special measures or turning into an academy or even closing the school or whatever, leaving that generation of that group in that locality all feeling that the time is wasted, they are failures. What have you achieved? What have you achieved? You haven't improved the quality of education in that locality. So, if I could wave a magic wand, it would be that all schools would be able to draw on it's built into the system. Teachers with experience, teacher trainers with experience, work with teachers in schools, and that experience is what beds in. Whatever structure you use, whether it's seminars, whether it's cooperation between schools, whichever principle you use, and there are various models that are possible, and you keep that going, you bed that as in the system. And insofar as you have inspection, it's purely in order to make some kind of overall view of comparability, but not in order to punish people, and to give guidance to those experienced teachers and say, well, there's some other things I saw down the road, but you keep in-service training going, as part of the job. It shouldn't be who wants to go on this course, or there's a course down the road I think you all ought to go on, or something like that. It should be just built in. So in-service training by experienced teachers and teacher trainers should be just built into the job. That should be in the contract.
Some teachers actually tried to block Ofsted inspections in protest in recent events. They actually said, you know, you're not coming in. Thinking about Flora Cooper, thinking about other head teachers said, you know, we're not doing it. I mean, do you think that's the right approach? I mean, do you back that sort of like more radical action to try and change the system?
I respect teachers for doing that because they're sick and tired of it. And when people in employment of any sort get sick and tired, it's their conditions of work. If you want a trade union bit of jargon, it is their conditions of work. They are finding their conditions of work insupportable. Ideally, they should work through the union. They should work through the union, otherwise they'll get isolated and get picked off. So that's all I say as an experienced trade unionist myself. Work through the union and make sure that you don't get picked off. And at the same time, of course, criticise Ofsted, as I'm doing now, but pose an alternative. Because what will happen is the government will go and say, pick this group off and say, look at them. They don't like having quality control. They don't like being monitored. They don't want to raise standards. And what we have to show whenever we criticise, we have to say, we have an alternative. Let's look at what they do in other countries. Let's look and see, in fact, look at the old models that were used in this country in the 50s with the old HMI, His Majesty's, as it depends what it is, Inspectorate. Instead of sidelining the HMI, find a way in which they can be brought in. So so that's all I would say. And I'm not saying this in any patronising way. It's just someone who's been round the houses and back, been round the schools and back. Be careful, get support through the union and keep coming up with suggestions. I've only made one or two, but there are great ways to advise teachers and build it in. It should be in our teachers' contract that they get in-service training as part of it. And in-service training would do much more than, you know, Ofsted inspectors arriving at a school that they know little or nothing about. I'll tell you very quickly a story. I arrived in a school and the head teacher was in despair. He virtually had his head and his hands on his desk, and I said, what's the problem? And he said, we've had Ofsted in here and they're looking at my marks in year 6. And he said, look, the children, I'm looking at their marks from year 1 and they haven't improved into year 6. And you know what he said to them? They're not the same children. There's got a high churn in this school. We have a refugee hostel nearby, all right? They're not the same children. You know what the Ofsted inspector said? That's got nothing to do with it. So just figure that. Ofsted inspector said, we're only looking at numbers, not at children. We know what kind of culture believes in that people are only numbers. You know, people like George Orwell wrote about it, you know, or Aldous Huxley. They wrote about the idea of a society reduced to numbers. That's what was going on. That's why that head teacher was in despair, because Ofsted said, I'm not interested in the children, only the numbers, even though it wasn't the same children. So that head teacher had children in year 6 who'd only been there for about a term. It was incredible and wonderful and brilliant that they were speaking any English. You know, how many Ofsted inspectors have learned English in 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 2 terms? Those children will be bilingual within a year. How many of them are like that? They should be worshipping at those children's feet. Those children go home and they translate for their parents at the local doctor's surgery, and with any advice they need from the Citizens Advice Bureau. I've interviewed people on the radio about this. These children operate bilingually, and instead of that, the teacher was saying, this school is failing. That's the craziness of what you get. And that teacher, that head teacher, was suffering because he was told he was a failure. He wasn't a failure. That's completely wrong, completely wrong.
Michael, very conscious you've given a huge amount of your time already. Thank you ever so much for joining us for this interview. It's been really interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.